Welcome to Israel's Independence and Leaders. And the reason I'm very excited about this class is because it is Israel's 75th birthday, and we just celebrated. I want you to think about something for a moment. Most of the countries in the world, our independence go back probably a few hundred years. We have in America, we go back to 1776. I never saw George Washington or John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. I never saw these individuals. I read about them my whole life. And I admire them. I admire the history of our country, and I admire the history of your countries as well. Your history is very important. What's amazing to me is that Israel is 75 years old. It's 75 years old, which means there are still people, think about this for a moment, there are still people walking around the streets of Tel Aviv, the streets of Jerusalem, the streets of Haifa, the streets of Eilat, wherever they are throughout Israel. They're still walking around, and you know what? They were probably alive during the rebirth of the nation of Israel. Think about that for a minute. In fact, it was Shimon Peres, if you remember that name, a very, very, very influential Israeli politician who was the last of the Israeli founders, of the founding fathers of the state of Israel, who finally passed away just a few years ago. But think about that for a minute, that there are still people who walk around Israel who were there the moment the state was born. So it kind of gives you a different feel. It always makes me feel as if we're talking about something very distant, but also something very, very close. And that's why it's important as we're going to study Israel's independence and its leaders, because what's amazing, and I hope that you see over the next few weeks, is that God used amazing individuals to help with the rebirth of the state of Israel. And what you're going to find is that some of those individuals were very religious people. Some were even believers in the Lord Jesus. And then you're also going to find that some of these people were very secular, socialist, if you will, maybe even communist. And yet God would use all of these various people on a spectrum of faith, on a spectrum of politics, in order to bring about the rebirth of the state of Israel. All right, everybody. Well, here it is. Here's our three gentlemen that we're going to be looking at over the course of the next few weeks. Tonight, we're going to look at Theodor Herzl. He's there on the left, and I patterned my beard after Theodor Herzl. I don't know if you see some similarities there, okay? He just has more hair on his head than me. Then the next week, we're going to look at David Ben-Gurion, who was Israel's first prime minister. But he didn't just appear out of nowhere as prime minister. He is a very influential politician and leader in Israel's history, even prior to the state of Israel. And he was going to be working off of what Theodor Herzl had done. So by learning from what we're going to learn about Theodor Herzl tonight is what David Ben-Gurion is going to be standing on as he declares Israel's independence. And then finally, we're actually going to go back in time with Eliezer Ben Yehuda, that individual that you see right there with those awesome glasses, and he is looking as dapper as can be, has such a fascinating story about the rebirth, not only of a nation. Theodor Herzl and David Ben-Gurion helped to establish the political nature of the state of Israel, but Eliezer Ben Yehuda brought in a component that linked and bound all the Jewish people together with a language. He resurrected the Hebrew language so that the Jewish people coming in from Eastern Europe and areas of Russia and even areas of the Middle East will all be bound together by a language, the Hebrew language. And his story is such a fascinating story. So I'm excited to tell you about Eliezer Ben Yehuda. So you want to stick around and come back in a couple weeks for that one. So let's talk about Theodor Herzl, everybody. He's a hero of mine, actually. Oh, let me get my thing going here. He's a hero of mine. I've come to admire Theodor Herzl more and more and more because I actually don't think Theodor Herzl ever expected in his life to do what he did in helping to reestablish the Jewish state. I mean, honestly, most of his life was not dedicated to the establishment of the state of Israel, or a Jewish state. And I'll show you in a moment, but it's a very humbling story, and people believed in him. He was a charismatic individual who could lead people with a vision. And I have to say this too, because it's important to understand that Theodor Herzl is called the father of modern Zionism. Zionism is a term that I'm sure if you're in this class right now, you're a Zionist. That means you believe Israel has a right to, the Jewish people have a right to exist in their ancient homeland. If you're a Zionist, if you believe Israel, the Jewish people have a right to exist in their ancient homeland, raise your hand if you believe that. If you believe that, then that means you're a Zionist. And if you're a Christian, then that means you're a Christian Zionist. That means you believe that the Jewish people have a right to exist in their ancient homeland. And you know what? You can be a Zionist and believe Jewish people shouldn't live in Jerusalem. You can be, believe it or not. There are Jewish people that believe that Jewish people have a right to exist in their ancient homeland, but not in certain areas of the homeland. They can divide up the land and still be considered a Zionist. I don't believe that, of course, but I'm just trying to say there is, you can argue with people about what land belongs to who, about the West Bank or about areas of the Gaza Strip. I have my opinions, but there are other people that have different opinions. And you know what? They still would consider themselves Zionists because they believe that Jewish people have a right to exist in their ancient homeland. And so Theodor Herzl isn't the inventor of Zionism. They call him the father of modern Zionism, but he isn't the inventor of it. Actually, it's interesting because Jewish people have been praying for the return of their people to Israel for thousands of years. They have been Zionists because the Bible is Zionist. The Bible talks about over and over and over again that the Jewish people will return. Read Ezekiel chapter 36, read Ezekiel chapter 37. These prophetic passages of Israel's return to their to the land that God had promised them. And these Jewish individuals for thousands of years have been praying for God to restore them to their ancient homeland. What Theodor Herzl is going to do, even I was reading about this, Theodor Herzl's grandfather was actually a pretty religious Jewish individual who wrote books about Jewish people returning to their ancient homeland. And so, it goes back. It's a part of the DNA. It's a part of the structure of who the Jewish people are. They cry out at the end of Passover and Yom Kippur next year in Jerusalem because it's a part of who they are. Jerusalem, the land, all of it. It's bound in their DNA. But what Theodor Herzl is going to do, as we see later on, is he's going to take all the prayers of the Jewish people over the thousands of years that they've been in exile, and he is going to take those prayers and put them to political action. That's what he's going to do. He was born on May 2nd, 1860 in Budapest, Hungary. And he was educated a certain way that's going to play a major part in who he is as an individual. He was educated in the spirit of the German Jewish Enlightenment. We'll talk about that in a moment. He moved with his family from Hungary to Vienna, Austria, after the death of his sister in 1878. He received a doctorate of law in 1884, and he worked in Vienna and Salzburg courts for 1 year, and then he goes, this isn't me. Okay, so the guy's a lawyer, but he goes, this isn't what I feel called to. He loved writing. And so he became a journalist. Journalism was his passion. He became the Paris correspondent for the New Free Press in Vienna. So he moves to Paris and he becomes the correspondent talking about the things that are going on in Paris. I'll share with you some pictures that I have of him growing up. That's his father, Jacob, his sister, Pauline, who dies in 1878. There he is, Theodore, in the middle there with his hand on his cheek, and then his mother, Jeanette. What's interesting is that Theodor Herzl and his family were not religious at all. He grew up right next to an incredibly significant synagogue in Eastern Europe called the Didnt Street Synagogue. And he grew up right next door to it. It becomes a part of his childhood, but they were not religious individuals, even though he grew up right next to this very influential synagogue in Budapest, Hungary. And so remember, bear that in mind as we continue our conversation and our little history lesson here of Theodor Herzl, that he was not a religious individual. You'll notice in the pictures, he's never wearing a kippah. He's got a nice looking beard, but I don't think that was a beard because he was a religious individual. That was just a beard from the time period. And so he tried to blend in as much as possible. He ends up marrying a woman named Julie Naskor, and they have 3 children, Paulina, Hans, and Margarita. And the children, it's an interesting relationship that Theodor Herzl will have with his children over time. It's quite depressing, some of the things that happen to his children, but we'll save that for another class. Theodor Herzl loved his mother. As we're approaching Mother's Day, he loved his mother a lot. He valued her opinion. They were good friends. Julie and his mother didn't get along so well. Okay, and so there was always a little tension in the marriage. But that's Theodor Herzl right there that you can see with his children. Herzl was an ardent Germanophile, a Germophile. He saw the Germans as the best. There's a Yiddish word, or not Yiddish, a German word, Kulturvolk, cultured people. Germans were to be emulated in Europe. He thought that they were very, very cultured people of Central Europe and embraced the German ideal of this word called Bildung, where people read great works of literature by Goethe and Shakespeare and could allow one to appreciate beautiful things in life and thus become morally better people. The Bildung theory tended to equate beauty with goodness. Here's where I would say how you might fit Theodor Herzl into today's culture. He's an elitist. That's what he is. Elitist people today think the exact same way. Elitists think nice things equate to some moral goodness in some way. He really believed that good literature, all the cream that rises to the top, these things at the top, these beautiful things that you read and you watch and you engage with in culture will make you a morally better individual. And Germany was just the outlet for all of this amazing literature and all of this amazing teaching that would make mankind better. Herzl believed that through Bildung, Hungarian Jews such as himself, because remember, he's Hungarian, he's not German, but that if Hungarian Jews adopted this German way of thinking, this Bildung way of thinking, such as himself, they could shake off, look what it says here, their shameful Jewish characteristics caused by long centuries of impoverishment and oppression and become civilized Central Europeans, a true Kulturvolk along with the German lines. He loved German life. He loved German culture. And do you hear what it's saying there? Is that Theodor Herzl is going to frame the way he understands how the world looks at Jewish people through this. Jewish people have been persecuted, everybody, for thousands of years. In fact, during this time, the Russian pogroms are going on. That's the story of Fiddler on the Roof, if you've ever watched Fiddler on the Roof. And so as the Russian pogroms are happening and the Russians are persecuting the Jewish people, it's called anti-Semitism. And there's anti-Semitism happening in other places as well. Theodor Herzl believes, here's the problem. Here's why there's anti-Semitism. It's because all you Jewish people who live are impoverished and you're not educated, you're oppressed because of a certain reason. You're not enlightened. And if you become like the country that you are living in, and you stop being Jewish and you embrace and live as a Jew, as a German would live, this high elitist standard, then guess what? There will be no more anti-Semitism. There will be no more persecution whatsoever. And he really, really, really believed that. And so bear that in mind as we continue our conversation, because we run into this issue. Remember that Theodor Herzl is just a journalist. He's a nobody at this point. Nobody knows Theodor Herzl, okay? Just like you don't know about the editorial writer for your local newspaper. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But not many people know the local journalists for your local newspaper, okay? People didn't know Theodor Herzl. He didn't have a big name at all. And so he's in Paris, and this event happens in 1894. So we're fast forwarding a few years, and there's this individual named Captain Alfred Dreyfus. He's Jewish. He's 35 years old. And he was arrested in December of 1894 for treason by the French. He was baselessly convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for sharing French military secrets to the German embassy in Paris. And he was sent to Devil's Island and pushed out there to just be away from the French people. In 1896, though, 2 years later, evidence appeared identifying who the true criminal was. Dreyfus was completely innocent. Major Ferdinand Esterhazy is the one that evidence shows is the one who actually committed treason. But high-ranking officials acquitted Esterhazy after a 2-day trial, and they proceeded to lay additional charges on Dreyfus. Okay? So Dreyfus he's an innocent man. And this actually begins to create tension. There's Dreyfus actually on the island, on Devil's Island. And journalists like Herzl continued to press for answers, stoking a growing movement of political support for Dreyfus. France started to split in half over this Dreyfus issue. And so they called Dreyfus back in 1899, and Dreyfus was returned to France for another trial. France was divided between those who supported Dreyfus and those who didn't. And Dreyfus was actually convicted again. He was sentenced to another 10 years on top of life. But later he was pardoned and released and eventually exonerated by 1906. And think about this. After you were convicted innocently and sent to jail, Dreyfus goes back to the French army and serves in World War I. Think about that. He actually goes back and serves in the army, and he ends his career as a lieutenant colonel. But I want you to know something. This created something that really struck at the core of Theodor Herzl. It's called the Dreyfus Affair. And you know what it did for Theodor Herzl? It uncovered the anti-Semitism that was brewing in all facets of France. The military, the press, the politicians, even the common people were convicting. They were trying to get blame Dreyfus, even though they had evidence that he was innocent. They would post anti-Semitic cartoons like this one. Nearly 69 riots or disturbances broke out throughout France. There was stone throwing. They were chanting anti-Semitic slogans. They attacked Jewish property and Jewish people, and police even resisted helping the Jewish people in France during this time of the Dreyfus trial. All the while, there is Theodor Herzl watching what's going on in France, and he goes, this isn't what I believed in. I thought if we assimilated into our culture, if we assimilated into our world, if we assimilated into the country that we live in, then the people would accept us. If we rise to the top, if we embrace the culture, the high culture of our societies that we live in. And you know what? Here he is staring at this individual right here, Alfred Dreyfus, who as a Jewish man embraced the French way of life so much that he fought for the French way of life. He joined the military. He defended the French way of life. And yet, even in the middle of embracing the culture and being someone of stature in the French society, yet somehow anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jewish people, was the thing that still ended up plaguing Dreyfus. And it confused Herzl. It confused him so much that he had to change his mind about everything that he believed. They were even chanting death to the Jews during this time. And how could this be in France? How could this happen? You know, even before the Holocaust, I want you to know this, even before the Holocaust, we're talking the Holocaust starts to ramp up in the 1930s. This is the late 1800s. Theodor Herzl is telling the Jewish people, we've got to get out of here. Think about that. We've got to get out of Europe. And so he begins to make certain movements. But listen to this. The Dreyfus affair engendered numerous anti-Semitic demonstrations, which in turn affected sentiment within the Jewish communities of Central and Western Europe. At the same time, Jews of the Russian Empire were under pressure of the pogroms in response to political instability within the Pale. These factors persuaded Theodor Herzl, one of the founding fathers of Zionism, that the Jews must leave Europe and establish their own state. It happens with this moment. Do you know how influential this moment is in France? See, we don't really think much about it unless you're living in France, but it was only in 2021 that French President Macron opened up a Dreyfus museum. A Dreyfus museum in 2021. They're still talking about Captain Alfred Dreyfus. And the president of France is there. And you know what was still going on? There was still issues of politics in 2021 when it came to opening up a museum related to Captain Alfred Dreyfus. Political tension. Think about that. So it just goes to show, you know, this isn't just some history lesson. This continues on. It's a part of the French culture in some way, this Dreyfus affair, and it will change the way Theodor Herzl thinks. Theodor Herzl wrote this in a book that we'll highlight later. It's a book he wrote called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. He says, if France, a bastion of emancipation, progress, and universal socialism, can get caught up in the maelstrom of anti-Semitism and let the Parisian crowd chant, kill the Jews, where can they be safe once again, if not in their own country? Assimilation, remember, this was the king of assimilation just a few moments ago. Assimilation does not solve the problem because the Gentile world will not allow it, as the Dreyfus affair has so clearly demonstrated. That's what Theodor Herzl wrote. Now, I want you to see something. This book, Der Judenstaat, was published in February of 1896. Der Judenstaat argued, it was a very important, it's not a big book at all, it's more like a pamphlet. Der Judenstaat argued that Jewish people must leave Europe for Palestine, their historic homeland. Only through a Jewish state could they avoid anti-Semitism. And what's fascinating is that this book begins to get disseminated around Europe. And I want to introduce, I'll read another one here. It says this, therefore, he writes, I believe, this is actually the ending of Der Judenstaat, his book. He says, therefore, I believe that a wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence. The Maccabeans will rise again, he writes. Let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who wish for a state will have it. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our homes. The world will be freed by our liberty, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness. And whatever we attempt there to accomplish for our own welfare will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity. You know what's fascinating is I think about these words that were written in 1896. And here we are in 2023. And we're using technology that a lot of it was developed in Israel. And this is the vision that Theodor Herzl had when he wrote this in 1896. Think about all the medications and healthcare products and technology and ideas and all of the PhDs and all of the Nobel Peace Prize winners, all of those influential components of Israel. Israel is a place that is called the startup nation. So much is coming from Israel. And here in 1896, And what is it doing coming from Israel? It's benefiting the whole world. And here in 1896, this is exactly the vision Theodor Herzl had, that whatever we attempt there to accomplish for our own welfare, for us, will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity, of everybody. Now, what's funny is his pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, begins to get sent around. This is one of my favorite characters, everybody, in the history of Israel's rebirth. His name's William Heckler. Look at that beard. You thought that Theodor Herzl's beard was good. Look at that beard right there. It's a great beard. William Heckler was an Anglican priest, a chaplain at the British Embassy in Vienna. He loved the Jewish people, and he was a scholar of biblical prophecy. He believed a homeland for the Jewish people should be established in Palestine. And he wrote this, actually. Listen to this. I hope you resonate with this, because I do. This is why I love William Heckler. The duty of every Christian is to love the Jews, for they are still beloved for their fathers' sakes, adding, blessed shall that nation be which loves the Jews. For God promised to Abraham and his children, I will bless them that bless thee. Think about, I connect with William Heckler. And so here he is, and William Heckler gets a copy of Theodor Herzl's book, Der Judenstaat, and reads right through it and says, I've got to meet this guy. I've got to meet Theodor Herzl. So the chaplain at the British Embassy in Vienna, Reverend William Heckler, announced himself at the home of the author of Der Judenstaat, Theodor Herzl, on March 10th, 1896. So Heckler just walks right up to Theodor Herzl's home, and Herzl describes him in his diary. And I love this. Listen, Herzl described the figure he then encountered as a likable, sensitive man with the long gray beard of a prophet, who explained to him that he considered his work, the Der Judenstaat, that book, the Jewish state, to be the fulfillment of prophecy, and offered to open the door for him to the German royal family. Hey, listen, this is God at work here. I really believe this. Because remember, let's rewind what we learned about Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl grew up to right next door to a very influential synagogue in Budapest, Hungary, and was not a religious man at all. Very secular minded, if you will. And all of a sudden comes along this man with a fantastic beard. He looks like a prophet who reads his work, knocks on his door one day, and reminds Theodor Herzl of something which I just love. He says, Theodor, I know what you're trying to do, and I want to remind you what you're doing is not just political by wanting to help reestablish a Jewish state. It's biblical. It's biblical. Think about it. A Christian who loves the Lord, who studied God's word, loved God's prophetic word, is knocking on Theodor Herzl's door, and he's saying to him, this mission you're on is so important, and it's biblical, and I'm going to show you how important it is, because I'm going to connect you, Theodor Herzl, with the right people. And so he says, I'm going to connect you because of the connections that he had growing up, and the connections that he had as the chaplain of England in Vienna, at the embassy in Vienna. He's going to connect people to the right place, connect Theodor Herzl to the right people. So look what happens. Heckler arranged an extended audience with Frederick I, the Grand Duke of Baden, on April 1896. The Grand Duke was the uncle of the German Emperor, the Kaiser, Wilhelm II. And through the efforts of Heckler and the Grand Duke, Herzl would publicly meet with Wilhelm II in 1898, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. And the meeting significantly advanced Herzl's and Zionism's legitimacy in the Jewish and world opinion. Heckler, a man who loved the Lord, who loved the scriptures, knocks on the door one day and actually becomes incredibly close friends with Theodor Herzl. I didn't put this in the notes, but Theodor Herzl said he's a little cuckoo. You know, I love that. He's a little out there. He's got ideas I don't agree with, but I think he's incredibly important to this mission. And he's reminding me that it's not just a political mission. God put William Heckler there to remind them it's a biblical mission. And you know what? He's a Christian. I just love that. I always resonate with William Heckler. What happens is this: things begin moving, and instead of just sitting around, now Theodor Herzl is going to begin organizing people that have the same call he does. There were a lot of Jewish people at that time that wanted to see a homeland reestablished for the Jewish people. And so they're going to begin to make movements by organizing and creating structures to help establish a Jewish state. And this actually will happen in 1897. It will begin with the first Zionist Congress. There were Jewish people there. There were Christians there. Men like William Heckler were invited to be delegates of the first Zionist Congress. It happened in Basel, Switzerland on August 29th through the 31st, 1897. There were 208 delegates, 26 press correspondents. It was chaired by Theodor Herzl himself. The result of the meeting was that the Congress, the first Zionist Congress, established what was called the Basel Program. I'll show you that in a moment. It adopted, think about this, that day they adopted Hatikva as its anthem. Do you know what Hatikva is? Hatikva is Israel's national anthem today. So if you ever watch the Olympics, or you watch something to do with sports, or maybe something going on in Israel, and you hear their national anthem, that was actually already the anthem that the first Zionist Congress chose for their organization, for their gatherings. And so Israel would just adopt what the first Zionist Congress had already done. The international press covered the conference, which created conversations globally about Zionism. You know, the average person at this time is not thinking at all. The average person is not thinking at all about Jewish people returning to the Ottoman Empire. Okay. Why would a European Jew want to go to the continent of Asia? Why would they want to go to the Ottoman Empire? They're not even thinking about it that much. But see, now all of a sudden the press gets involved and begin to write articles, and it just begins a little bit and it will grow over time. I'll show you what I mean by that. Let me move on. The Basel Program. This is a great picture. You'll see Theodor Herzl in the middle. There are other amazing Jewish men here who were very influential in the founding of the Zionist Congress, the first Zionist Congress, and whose names are remembered in Israeli history. And so it becomes really, really important. And it's this program called the Basel Program. And what's awesome is that they actually come up with 4 points. So they came up with an agenda and a mission that will drive them forward. And so the first one is the promotion of the settlement of the Jewish agriculturalists, the artisans, and the tradesmen that are already in Palestine, that were already in the Ottoman Empire and developing the lands. There were already Jewish people returning to the ancient to Palestine, as it was called at that time during the Ottoman Empire. They were already building farms. They were buying land. Men like Rothschild were buying up land for the Jewish people as they were redeveloping it and getting rid of all the malaria. So the Basel Program first establishes the promotion of these settlements that they had. The next is the federation of all Jews in local or general groups according to the laws of their various countries. So to begin to make groups in various countries that would all connect to this Zionist Congress, that becomes important as well. The strengthening of the Jewish feeling and consciousness to connect people not only to the fact that we're not just exiled, we shouldn't think separately, we shouldn't assimilate, we should be together, we should be one, and we should be thinking together for the benefit of what's going to happen when we return to the land. And finally, the preparatory steps for the attainment of those governmental grants which are necessary to the achievement of the Zionist purpose. So this is what they came up with. This was their vision. Which becomes important. And at the end of it all, Theodor Herzl writes this in 1897. He writes, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be greeted with universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it. Now, I want you to think about this, because honestly, this guy, I'm not saying he's a biblical prophet at all, but if you're going to buy a lottery ticket, you should have hung out with Theodor Herzl, okay? Because he was spot on. Not only when he writes does he say, we want to be a people that benefits all of humanity, which Israel is today, but he's even saying this in 1897, that in 50 years, there will be a Jewish state. And what's fascinating is that if you count ahead 50 years, you get to the year 1947. And in 1947, the United Nations granted the Jewish people the right to return to their ancient homeland. I don't know how he did it. I don't know how he chose that number. But in 1947, UN 181 was signed, and the nations agreed that the Jewish people, it's called the Partition Plan, the Jewish people have a right to establish their own state in their own land, in what was then the British Mandate. That was 50 years later. In 5 years, they'll laugh at me. But certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it, he said. Now, I want to fast forward here because Herzl meets with some interesting people. In 1896, we already talked about the fact that he met with Frederick I, the Grand Duke of Baden, to present the idea of a Jewish homeland. And actually, Baden knew William Heckler, and they talked about the Bible, and they talked about prophecies, and this, that, and the other. And Baden was totally on board. So Frederick I takes this up to his uncle, or to his nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And so that will make its way up. He's going to talk to him. In between there, in 1896, actually, there was an attempt to meet the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II to present his solution. I love this, for a Jewish state within the Ottoman Empire. And so look what it says. This is so fascinating to me. So Theodor Herzl is going to meet with the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Remember, Israel was at that time in the Ottoman Empire. So he's going to go there, and he actually didn't get the attention of the Ottoman Sultan. He wasn't able to meet with the Ottoman Sultan, but he met with his Grand Vizier, who was a very powerful individual as well. And he says this: I'd like for the Jews that if you could give us the opportunity to take land in the Ottoman Empire, the Jews would pay the Turkish foreign debt. We'll pay off the debt. We will pay toward Turkish foreign debt and help Turkey regain its financial footing in return for Palestine as a Jewish homeland. See, this is amazing, and I want you to keep this in mind. Look what Theodor Herzl is doing. He's not saying, we're just going to run into the Ottoman Empire and take our land back. No, he's trying to actually offer solutions on ways to create a Jewish state in a very political, diplomatic way. Hey, look, if you let Jews create a state, Jewish people create a state in your empire, in the area of Palestine, if you let us do that, we will pay off some of the debt that you have, we'll help establish you and ground you financially as an empire, and we will help you, we'll work together if you do this. Nothing came from that meeting. But fast forward 2 years, all this is happening very quickly. Kaiser Wilhelm, the emperor of the German Empire, goes to the Ottoman Empire to meet with the Sultan and to go to the Holy Land. And actually, Herzl's going to meet with him 3 times there. First, he meets with him on October 15th in 1898 in Istanbul, when the Kaiser goes to meet with the Sultan. He'll meet the Kaiser again in Palestine in a place called Mikvah Israel in 1898 on October 29th. That was actually Herzl's first time in Israel. He had never been there before. That was his first time when he went to go meet with the Kaiser. And finally, in November 2nd, he meets with him. We'll talk a little bit more about that meeting in a moment. It's a very important one. And in 1901, again, Herzl meets with the Sultan, a different Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, who turned down Herzl's offer to consolidate Ottoman debt in exchange for a charter allowing the Zionists to access Palestine. So again, they're trying to work to build relationships, to establish relationships, not just take land. They wanted to work with the nations. They wanted the nation's approval. That's very important. Look at this. When Kaiser Wilhelm was going to go to the Sultan in Istanbul, something interesting happens. Look at this. They're in Istanbul, Turkey, and during the Istanbul audience, the Kaiser asked Herzl what he wished for him to ask of the Sultan. The Emperor of Germany at this time was actually somewhat interested. I shouldn't say very. He was somewhat interested in what Herzl was presenting. And so he was interested enough to talk to the Sultan about it. And so he meets with Herzl here in 1898. It says his first meeting that Herzl had with the Kaiser was in Istanbul on October 15th. And on that day, he says to Herzl, tell me in a word what I am to ask the Sultan. To which Herzl replied, a chartered company under German protection, which means this is the way we want to work it. It'll be a chartered company under the German protection that will allow us to set up a Jewish state in the Ottoman Empire. And the Kaiser brought the subject up twice with the Sultan, and the Sultan refused. Even in return for the Jews assuming the sizable Turkish foreign debt, as Zionism was highly unpopular amongst the local population in Palestine. Go figure, okay? And so it gets shut down. But I want you to look at that picture right there, everybody. You see that picture on the screen? A picture is worth 1,000 words. The picture actually didn't even look like this. This is a 125-year-old Photoshop. It really is. If you look down close, it almost looks like Theodor Herzl's hovering on the air. Do you notice that? If you can look really close at him, his feet look like they're above the ground. Well, that's because they really wanted to get a photograph. This is the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, meeting with Theodor Herzl in Palestine at that time. But the problem was that the photographer couldn't get it. Would all happen so fast. They were too far apart. And so the picture, they couldn't get them both together. And so the photographer said, just stand there, Theodore, and I will take a picture of you and I'll Photoshop you in. And that's what we'll send to the newspapers. And so they Photoshopped them in. Do you see his feet hovering above the ground there? This picture, though, this picture is what made Theodor Herzl famous. This picture, think about it. You have a Jew, a Jewish person in their ancient Jewish homeland, talking to the Emperor of Germany, which controlled a lot of Europe at that time. And they're there talking about Zionist desires to return Jewish people to their homeland. And now all of a sudden, the papers around the world are lighting up. And this is the picture. Who is the man standing before Kaiser, the emperor? It's Theodor Herzl. He, in this picture, becomes the representative of the Jewish people in a return to their ancient homeland. This is the picture. Most people don't realize, and he's Photoshopped in. That's the best part about it. He's hovering above the ground practically. Herzl had a second formal public audience with the emperor at the latter's tent camp on the Street of the Prophets in Jerusalem on November 2nd in 1898. And at the public presentation outside of Mikvah in Jerusalem, Herzl learned, this is important what happens, even though it kind of looks like they're having a great conversation and things are going the way that they wanted it to go. Look what it says here. Excuse me. Herzl learned that Kaiser's request to the Sultan had not been successful, and the Kaiser no longer had any interest in Herzl or any interest in Zionism, although Kaiser Wilhelm had backed away from supporting Herzl's project. Several press publications posited the meeting as a monumentous and successful moment, as some political legitimacy had been lent to Herzl and Zionism, even though the whole thing went sour for Theodor Herzl on his first visit to the Holy Land. Even though it all went sour, this guy, the Kaiser, the emperor, is supposed to go, it was a great meeting. I think we're really going to make some headway here. He goes, you know what? He didn't say yes, and I'm done with you. I don't have time for this anymore. It actually ended very sourly for Herzl, but this picture became the talk of the town. And it made Theodor Herzl famous. I love that. Actually, that place right here, if you see where they're standing, is here in Israel. It's called Mikvah Israel. This is the statue that was built in honor of that moment. And I want you to hear the Daily Mail in 1898 actually wrote about that picture. And this is what it said in 1898 on November 18th, as all this picture was going around the world. Listen to what it says. One of the most important results, if not the most important, of the Kaiser's visit to Palestine is the immense impetus it had given to Zionism. This is being written in the newspapers. The movement for the return of the Jews to Palestine. The gain to this cause is the greater since it is immediate, but perhaps more important is still the wide political influence which this imperial action is like to have. Listen to what it says. It's so backwards. What actually happened? There's Theodor Herzl. He's actually been photoshopped in, and the Kaiser, the emperor goes, no thanks. I'm out of here. Okay? Then the newspapers print it and they go, hey, look at what's going on here. The Kaiser's got his back. Look at the imperial action is likely to happen. It has not been generally reported that when the Kaiser visited Constantinople, Dr. Herzl, the head of the Zionist movement, was there. Again, when the Kaiser entered Jerusalem, he found Dr. Herzl there. There's Dr. Herzl going everywhere the Kaiser's going. These were no mere coincidences, but the visible signs of accomplished facts. Oh my goodness, this is a complete different report than what actually happened. I love this. Structure here. I love this sculpture. I'm sorry, not structure, but sculpture. Because when you're looking at it from this angle, it just looks like Theodor Herzl is talking with the emperor. But then when you look at it from a different angle, notice the emperor is split in half. And there's a reason for that. And this is actually the one of the very first farms in Israel. It's called that was run by Jewish people. It's called Mikvah Israel. It's still there. And if you notice, the reason that the sculptor split the Kaiser in half, was not because he was mad at him, but because Theodor Herzl knew, I cannot bring the Jewish people back to the land unless I get through Kaiser. I have to move through Kaiser for this to happen. I have to move through the emperor. The emperor is a key person. And think about it. Even Theodor Herzl would be wrong. God would do something actually momentous. Even though the emperor would say no, it's that picture. The picture sold it. Zionism was on the rise. The Jewish people were moving, and they had the Sultan's ear. They had the emperor of Germany's ear, and so the Jewish people must be making some serious headway. Remember, this is before the days of Twitter, when somebody could go, "Nope, that's not what happened." At that point, if you're the emperor, you're going, "Well, it's out there. I can't change everything." So this is an important moment in Israel's history. I want to show you really quick some pictures of how influential Theodor Herzl is in Israel's history. I can't stress it. I mean, honestly, I can't stress it enough. This man is beyond a George Washington. George Washington was around for the founding of America. He is even more than that, because he never really had a chance to taste what would become the fruits of his labor. But I want you to notice this picture here. This is the day David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence, and who is hanging up above the provisional government of the Jewish state. Look at that big, giant picture of Theodor Herzl. And David Ben-Gurion, who's standing there reading the Declaration of Independence, will actually mention Herzl's name in the Independence, the Declaration of Independence. That's May 14th, 1948. The monumentous moment, there he is hanging up. Look at this. This is Israel's Knesset plenum. It's pretty hopping today. Lots of disagreements going on in Israel's government. This is where the prime minister sits and all the people who who represent the Israeli people. But do you see that far left-hand side, that little black square over there? I'm going to zoom in on it for you. Do you see who that is? Oh, that's Theodor Herzl. Look what he's doing. He's staring at the government and he's saying, don't you forget me. Don't forget what I've done. He helped establish the Jewish state. So much so, there he is, staring at the prime minister when he speaks, staring at the speaker, staring at at all of the politicians, reminding them who it was that helped establish this Jewish state. There's a town in Israel, just a little north of Tel Aviv. Do you see what it's called there? It's called Herzlia. You can travel through Herzlia. When you come to Israel with us, we'll drive up Route 20 as we go from Tel Aviv to Caesarea Maritime. And you know what town we'll pass right past? We'll go right past Herzlia, a town, an entire town named after Theodor Herzl. Oh, look at this. We're not done yet. Tel Aviv has an ode to Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl wrote a book called The Old New Land. In German, it's the Alt Neuland. Okay, you know what Tel Aviv, when they translated Alt Neuland into Hebrew, do you know what it came out as? Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is two Hebrew words. A tel is something old, and Aviv is something new, a spring, like the spring season. Tel is something old. It has old items in it. It's a mountain full of ancient artifacts. It's old, 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 old. And then Aviv is spring, like what we're experiencing right now. Spring, something new. So when they named the city of Tel Aviv, it was an ode to Theodor Herzl and the old Tel, new Aviv land. Isn't that interesting? A little ode, a little tip of the hat to Theodor Herzl in Tel Aviv. Look at all this. Every single town in Israel. Look at this. I try to take as many pictures as I possibly can for you. Every single town has a Herzl Street. There's a Herzl Street in Tel Aviv, a Herzl Street in Rehovot, a Herzl Street in Haifa, a Herzl Street in Jerusalem, a Herzl Street here, a Herzl Street there. I could have filled 3 pages with Herzl Streets. I didn't want to waste too much time on it, but I wanted you to see his name is everywhere. Herzl plays a major role in Israel's reestablishment. This is the top of Mount Herzl. Just over here, if you can see my finger pointing over this direction on the mountain, to your right is what you might know as Yad Vashem, which is Israel's Holocaust Memorial and Museum. And right next to Israel's Holocaust Museum and Memorial is Mount Herzl, which is basically the Arlington National Cemetery of Israel. It's where all of Israel's presidents and prime ministers are buried. It's where those who have lost their lives in service to their country, to the state of Israel, are buried. You can see some grave sites up there. They're scattered throughout the top of the mountain on Mount Herzl. Herzl died on July 3rd, 1904. He was very, very, very young. He was diagnosed with a heart issue earlier in the year, and he died of basically a hardening of the arteries. And a day before his death, he was actually with, I love this, everybody. Do you know who he was with the day before he died? He was with Heckler. All right, my hero, Heckler, the believer, the follower of Christ. And he said the day before his death, he told the Reverend William Heckler, "Greet Palestine for me. I gave my heart's blood for my people." So he dies in 1904, decades before Israel would even become a nation again. He stipulated in his will that he wanted a poor, a low-class funeral without speeches. He didn't want any flowers. He wanted to be buried in a vault beside his father and to lie there till the Jewish people shall take my remains to Israel. He was like a Joseph in the book of Genesis. Even though Joseph was buried in Egypt, he wanted to be buried in the promised land. So first he was buried in the Viennese cemetery in the district of Dobling, and his remains were brought to Israel in 1949 and buried on top of Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, which was named after him. The coffin was draped in a blue and white pall decorated with the Star of David, circumscribing the Lion of Judah and the 7 gold stars, recalling Herzl's original purpose for the flag of the Jewish state. This is his tomb now on top of Mount Herzl. in Israel. I hope that you see the influence that Theodor, if you have any questions too, please write them in the chat box. We have a few moments about Theodor Herzl's life. I'd like to see if you have any questions. But Theodor Herzl played a very important role in the redevelopment of the state of Israel. There wouldn't be a 75th anniversary if I really believe God had not called Theodor Herzl to the task. And I love the way it all worked out. It didn't all work out to plan. It wasn't the way I'm sure Theodor Herzl thought it would work out the way he thought it would, with all of these geniuses that were helping the cause. I mean, we're talking about some serious brain power at the first Zionist Congress, and yet things didn't really go the way they thought it would. But then at the same time, God in his ways would use the foolishness of the world in order to accomplish his task. One little photo that was photoshopped, who thought they were photoshopping back then, would become such an influential photo that would redefine the way that the world thought about the Jewish people returning to their homeland. It's amazing that Theodor Herzl saw the Jewish people and their plight in Europe, almost prophesying in some way of the coming of the Holocaust that would happen just a few decades later after his death. He saw this coming. This was the reason he wanted to reestablish a Jewish state. So Theodor Herzl becomes very influential in this development of a modern state of Israel. God would use Christians in the mix of it as well. And it's just an amazing story. I hope that you study Herzl more. He's kind of a hero. If you ever watch the Jew and Gentile podcast, you'll see him sitting behind me, and we like to reference him often. Y'all have a great night. We'll see you next week. We'll be sure to put these slides up in our notes so you can get them. If you want to review them yourself, you're fantastic. And we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.